We'll be starting in 20 minutes. What's different about these slides than the ones? I don't think there's any difference. It's weird. Okay, so we'll just remove that. Cool. We will be starting soon. We're going to be continuing our year one course. This is the backbone course for year one. And the style of all of the classes in year one are focusing more on subjects than on philosophers. And we're going to cherry pick essays and contributions from major contributors in 8 different fields, major questions in philosophy. We've completed the determinism versus free will section first. Then I believe we did the mind body problem. We read essays, basically just getting an overview of the field and the different types of camps which exist and the sort of the arguments that are made and the systems that exist. Just a very introductory, cursory survey of the battlefield of 8 different battlefields in philosophy. So after we did the mind body problem, we did the existence of God. That was a really fun section. After that, we did sort of a meta ethical question about subjectivity and the nature of ethical judgments and those types of statements, whether or not they were objective. Now we're in our 5th section. There are 8 total for the backbone course in the year one material. The other classes that go along with it, we're doing 2 of them, one on Thursday and one on Friday. They're both in the same style, but they're a little bit more of a deeper dive into some of these things. So on Thursday evenings, we start an hour earlier than we're starting here on Tuesday, but we are doing the philosophy of mind course, and we've just gotten into the section on behaviorism. So we have that's going to be continuing, and that's pretty exciting. And then on Fridays, we're doing the philosophy of religion, and we're just 3 or 4 essays into one of the two cursory introductory sections that get us into philosophical debates about the nature of God and if God talk is meaningful and the relationship between religion and ethics and theology and all of that fun stuff. But today we're doing the backbone course, and we're in the fifth section, and the fifth section is all on the a priori. So the nature of truth, knowledge, what's accessible to us. We've covered the distinction between the a priori and the a posteriori. We've said that in any field, especially and including philosophy, a lot of jargon is sort of not really that useful. You should take the special inside terms and just realize what they mean, and you don't really have to use them unless that they're attractive to people who want to sort of keep others from knowing that what they're really saying, and maybe because it's not as substantial. However, the a priori distinction is really useful in philosophy. And so pretty much everybody uses it, and it's kind of hard to avoid. So this whole section is understanding what the meaning of a priori is, and so we've talked about different distinctions that are not the same as a priori, a posteriori, and a lot of these essays are going to be focusing on how you classify the a priori and the a posteriori in relation to the analytic and synthetic distinctions. So we're in our third essay, and we're looking at Kant, who I believe invented a lot of the terms that we're using. These ideas were around, obviously. Socrates is talking about them. Ancient pre-Socratics are talking about them. But and so we've been dealing with these ideas for a long time. But Kant sort of gave us some terminology that we've all been using since then. So the distinction between analytic and synthetic is the truth of an analytic statement depends entirely on the meanings of the words used. That's it. It requires nothing else. So bachelors are unmarried men could be thought of as an analytic statement. You don't need to go and examine and do experiments and take surveys and try to figure out if that statement is true or false based on data you collect from the world. The statement is true or false based on the meaning of the words. 2 plus 3 make 5. If you know what 2 means, and you know what 3 means, and you know what summation means, and you know what fiveness is, you can know that that statement is true without going and testing anything, without there's nothing else you need besides the meanings of the words. Now that doesn't mean that you can come to know what those words mean without experience, right? So there's another distinction, because some philosophers will say there is such a thing as an analytic truth. It's a meaningful truth that is just dependent upon the meanings of the words themselves. um, but that doesn't mean that an argument against them would be something like, well, how can you know what the words even mean unless you develop, right? You can't know what threeness is until you learn to count, and you have to have that traced back to experience and all of this. So that doesn't matter. What matters is that the only thing you need to adjudicate the truth of the question, once you understand what the words mean, is just by looking at the words. And if you have to look for anything other than just the meanings of the words, we call that a synthetic statement. Now, Kant, who we're reading today, had the view that there are a priori. All right, so let's go back to the a priori, a posteriori distinction, which is a priori means a truth that you can know prior to experience. Okay, so it sounds pretty similar, but it's a different distinction. So, what Kant believed is that there were a priori synthetic truths. That is, truths that were not just reducible to the meanings of the words. They were about something, maybe about the world. They had meaning. There was meaningful truth you could gain prior to any experience, a priori, before experience, which is not just analytical, which is not just based on the fact that, if you look at the meanings of the words, then it has to be true. Uh, Opposed to that idea is the view of the logical positivists. And we haven't talked as much about them as we're going to have to eventually, but we're going to get to them pretty soon, I think. But the logical positivists have the view that all a priori truths are really just analytic. They're not really telling you something new beyond just what the words mean. If you investigate the meanings of the words, you'll find that truth is in there. And so you're not really gaining any knowledge. And so they actually called them all tautological, right? A tautology is just it's not really adding any knowledge here. Now, they could be useful, right? Knowing that 2 and 3 make 5 is a useful tool, but it's not new knowledge. Learning that 2 and 3 make 5 from the meaning, you already had that knowledge, because it's all just analytic, and therefore it's all really just tautological. There is no truth, that you're or let's say there is no new knowledge that can be gained in the analytic and therefore in the a priori. You can see there's a very similar distinction here between the rationalist projects and the empiricist projects, right? The empiricists are the people who are going to say all knowledge is trace backable to some sort of experience, and the rationalists think no, like Socrates. The rationalists think no, there's knowledge that you can have, that you can acquire or find innate within you, or something that is real knowledge, but it's just accomplished through the workings of your brain, or instantiate it. Now, we do talk just a little bit about Quine here, who maybe has a third alternative for us apart from this debate. Although today, when we start in about 5 minutes, we're going to continue reading on Kant, and then we'll go to Mill, and we've got a few other essays to read. Um, but Quine has this idea. Well, he just rejects that distinction. He says, okay, and I don't think that this notion that we're sharing of his here, actually has anything to say about the impossibility of a priori knowledge. But he has, the reason we talk about it is that there's another professor who's coming here very soon to give a really, really deep dive, awesome course in Quine, and it's relevant to this. And I discussed this class with him before I made these slides, and so I thought it'd be worth throwing in here. For Quine, you don't need to base your knowledge in anything that's foundational. It's instead a web. It's a web of notions. And some of the notions are integral in the core and they're connected to lots of other notions. So they'd be very, very difficult to replace. And some of them, rather, are way peripheral. And it's easy to say, oh, I was wrong about that one. Let me take it out and replace it with another one. And so there's still a hierarchy of the dependency on certain truths. But um, you don't really have to ground them. I mean, ultimately, you could be replacing a node and figuring out how to restructure the network, something like that. All right, so we're in this section, we're discussing questions such as, is there such a thing as a priori knowledge, right? Socrates thought yes. Uh, lots of people thought no, um, including Hume. But uh, it's not clear Hume thought we could have any knowledge. Well, no, it is clear he thought we really couldn't have most of the knowledge we think we have. Anyway, um, I don't know why he popped into my head when I was looking for another example. But the question is, can you know something before experience? Is there a knowledge that's acceptable to you? Or I mean that's accessible to you? All right. So a good example is everybody's favorite Descartes, right? I don't know. I don't know if there's a world around me. I could be dreaming my whole life. I could be deceived by a demonic God that wants me to believe in things that aren't real. He said, "Well, even if all that's the case, and I'm deceived about everything I think, I must be a thing which can be deceived. I must be a thinking thing. I must exist as a thing which thinks. At least whenever I try to doubt it, I have to affirm it. It must be the case. So that would count as a priori knowledge. Like I know that even if I don't even know if experience is even possible, I can know for sure that I as a thinking thing exist. At least when I try to doubt it, I can't. All right. So is it possible to have a priori knowledge? Is it really knowledge? What is the nature of what we can know? Can we know things about the world apart from experience? These are just some of the questions we're looking at. We've read on Plato, we've read Leibniz, we've read half of Kant, and we're going to finish the other half of Kant's essay today from the introduction to the critique of pure reason. I've misspelled Ewing there at the end. It looks like Ecking or Eckwing. Anyway, um, so we're going to read these essays. This is the fifth of 8 sections that we're going to spend some time looking at. In the introduction, I just talked about a couple of other sort of Platonic modern thinkers who are in very different ways Platonic. But in any event, we don't have to get into a lot of side tangential things, including Quine. There's a difference between an innate idea and an a priori truth. There can be overlap. A philosopher could think all are in the same category, or they could think there's no such thing as innate ideas, but still believe in the a priori. Um, so there's a whole lot of words that we use that are relevant, and this topic is helpful. And one of the other things we've seen in this backbone course is that all of these philosophical questions which we're examining, they all intertwine. There's a lot of significance to the determinism free will debate or the nature of God arguments, and all of these things are relevant to each other. And we've read lots of essays that talk about the a priori in our other sections, and here we are finally getting a chance to spend some time looking at it. So we will be starting in about 4 minutes with this section. And in all of these courses, essentially what we're doing right now is just for anybody else who's watching who's not in here, we're going to wait for Savad to get here. But essentially, there's a curriculum that's 3 years long. It's a core curriculum. The major that you build on top of that has, other things that go with it. But the core curriculum for any major is this philosophy curriculum. And so the first year is very different from the second year, which is very different from the third year. And in this first year, everything we're doing is introductory, it's surveying, it's taking little cherry picked essays from major contributors. It's trying to get comfortable with the feel of what these arguments are like and how relevant these ideas are to different thinkers. And just that's it. And then we have some complementary courses that go along with that backbone course, which I won't talk about anymore because we are ready to go. So we are going to get started with reading the rest. I'm already live, unfortunately, Savad, but we'll get a chance to talk in the after show because there's some things to discuss. Okay, so we are picking up right where we left off, and we're going to read the second half of this contest, say, reminding ourselves that we're talking about the a priori, the nature of the a priori, whether or not it's possible, whether or not it really counts as knowledge. And a lot of this is going to focus on sort of the debate or the distinction. Well, yeah, the debate between Kant and the logical positivists with this idea that Kant thought not only do you have a priori knowledge, but you have a priori knowledge that is not analytic. It doesn't reduce just to the meanings of the words. There's knowledge about things beyond the meanings of the words that you can have prior to experience. And that's sort of the main thrust of what he's talking about here. And we know the logical positivists are not only going to say that all a priori is synthetic, but that all of that is therefore also tautological. And so there's not really knowledge available in that way. We've spent a lot of time looking at Socrates. We've been doing second and third year stuff as well. So we know how relevant all this is and how it intertwines with even essays that we've read in the existence of God and ethics sections. They've been using the concepts of a priori and the terms for a while. So let's continue focusing on this. Section 4, the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments. In all judgments in which the relation of a subject to the predicate is thought, I take into consideration affirmative judgments only, the subsequent application of negative judgments being easily made. This relation is possible in two different ways. Either the predicate B belongs to the subject A as something which is covertly contained in this concept A, or B lies outside the concept A, although it does not indeed stand in connection with it. In the one case, I entitle the judgment analytic, in the other, synthetic. Analytic judgments, affirmative ones at least, which we're going to talk about here, are therefore those in which the connection of the predicate with the subject is thought through identity. Those in which this connection is thought through identity should be entitled synthetic. I'm sorry. Those in which this connection is thought without identity, thank you, without identity should be thought of as or entitled synthetic. Okay, this is we said before. for me at least, Kant is the most annoying philosopher to read, although he's really, really important. So we're not diminishing his importance. But his use of terms is a little bit his own. And so we're going to pay attention to the way he uses terms. He uses them brilliantly, so brilliantly that we've all adopted some of the ways he uses his terms. But we're going to start with his definition. So the analytic synthetic, one of the defining features, distinctions between the two is that the connection between the subject and the predicate in an analytic statement is identical. Okay. Hopefully he'll give us some examples, which he will. And if it's not thought through identity, then it would be synthetic. Okay. The former as adding nothing through the predicate to the concept of the subject, but merely breaking it up into those constituent concepts that have all along been thought in it. So it's contained within the idea, basically, right? Although confusedly, can also be entitled explicative. The latter, on the other hand, add to the concept of the subject a predicate which has not been in any wise thought in it, and which no analysis could possibly extract from it. And they may therefore be entitled ampliative. Okay. If I say, for instance, all bodies are extended, okay, all physical objects have a length, breadth, and width. There's a statement. You say, okay, is it true? Is it not true? How can I know? He's going to look at what's the quality of that statement. He's saying all A are B. The concept of body means something that has extension. This is an analytic judgment. The concept, the concept of body requires this other thing called extension. It's not really an other thing. It's identical with it. It's a part of the identity of what the concept means. You can't think about bodies. Try and imagine a wooden block or a shape or some object that doesn't have length, breadth, or width. What? There's no idea left. So that's what he means by analytic. Oh, no, amplitude? Yeah, and that's what he means by analytic. Okay. For I do not require to go beyond the concept which I connect with body in order to find extension is bound up with it. I don't need to go and measure 10 million different bodies and see, wow, this one has a length, a breadth, and a width. This one also has a shape. I bet we'll find one without one. Here, hand me another object. I'm going to see. Oh, you handed me an object. Oh, I'm so surprised. It also takes up space. Whoa. Do you think that's true of every object? I don't know. Let's go examine and find. Maybe we'll find one without length, breadth, and width. No, anything you can hand to me has a location. It has other qualities too, but it has extension. You don't need to go examine anything. It's contained within it. It's in the thought itself by what we mean, the concept of body. Okay. To me, with this predicate, I have merely to analyze the concept a priori, right? Before experience. That is to become conscious to myself of the manifold which I always think in that concept, right? There's other things about that concept too. It doesn't just mean extension, but it always means at least extension. So all I got to do is think, okay, what do I mean by these bodies, these objects? They're located somewhere. They have location. They exist in time. They're temporal. They exist in a causal nexus with other things, right? There's all sorts of things that might also be a part of the concept of a body. But if I ask myself, are all bodies things that have length, breadth, and width? It's like, do they have extension? Or at least one of the three, right? Of course. I just have to think about body. I don't have to go looking around at these things. I don't need experience. It's all a priori. The judgment is therefore analytic. But when I say all bodies are heavy, the predicate is something quite different from anything that I think in the mere concept of body in general. And the addition of such a predicate therefore yields a synthetic judgment. Okay. The analytic judgment would be all bodies have extension. A synthetic judgment, his definitions, we're just focusing on them, means that it would be an example like all bodies are heavy. What do you mean by heavy? Can I imagine a body that floats? Can I imagine a body that repels all other bodies rather than is attracted to them? What exactly do you mean by heavy? If I just sit and think about my concept of body, I don't get heaviness as necessary there. I could imagine bodies that aren't heavy. The concept doesn't force me into heaviness. So if it's true that all bodies are heavy or have mass that has a gravitational component or something like that, whatever heavy means here, if that statement is true, I'm going to have to go and examine more. I'm going to have to think more. I'm going to have to use more concepts than just the concept of body. Something more is required than just the concept of body to be able to know whether or not that's always true. Okay. Judgments of experience as such are one and all synthetic. So all judgments of experience are synthetic. He's not saying all synthetic judgments are judgments of experience, but he's saying all judgments which are traced back to experience, those are all synthetic. They require something other than just the meanings. For it would be absurd to found an analytic judgment on experience, since in framing the judgment, I must not go outside my concept. There is no need to appeal to the testimony of experience in its support. That a body is extended is a proposition that holds a priori and is not empirical, right? Now, it's important these sentences he's saying for the following reason. Somebody could say, I could come to know that all bodies have extension if I want to be committed to the idea that I should have experience and data and do science to conclude things. Why don't I just measure every object in the universe? And all of them will have a value of larger than zero when it comes to their extension qualities. And then I'm done. I'll say, I know for sure all bodies are extended. Yeah, you could come to know it that way. It'd be an awful lot of work for something that you could know if you just spent a second going, yeah, the concept requires it. It couldn't possibly be that I wouldn't see it as a body. I wouldn't recognize something as a body if it was less than a point. Okay. That a body is extended is a proposition that holds a priori okay, not empirical. For before appealing to experience, I have already in the concept of body all the conditions required for my judgment. I have only to extract from it, in accordance with the principle of contradiction, the required predicate, and in so doing, can at the same time become conscious of the necessity of the judgment at the same time. And that is what experience could never have taught me. Right? Even if you measure every object in the universe except one, you don't know that all bodies have extension. You just know it's really, really likely that the last body you haven't measured yet or looked at yet probably has extension too, but you don't know it, right? So not only can I know that all bodies have extension before I examine every body in the universe, I can know that that knowledge is indispensable, right? Like that I can know that if I were God and I measured every object except one, I couldn't know it. Right? So he's talking about the quality of a priori knowledge. Not only can you have it without experience, in this case at least, you can have it without experience or prior to experience, but you can also have another kind of knowledge that you wouldn't really get. What if you measured every object in the universe and you said, I've measured them all the objects have extension. I traveled through time. Every object that ever has or ever will exist has extension. Here is my giant mega data collection of all the data that shows the extensions, measurements of every object. Oh, cool. You know what you don't know? You don't know that that was necessary, right? So you have less knowledge, right? You can know the same thing that all objects have extension by, being God and having way too much time on your hands. But you can't know just by experience that of course they do. It's necessary that they do. But you can know both of those things, even if you just close your eyes and say, I'm not going to experience anything in the world. What do I know? Well, if there are things that can be presented to me as objects, they must have extension. I can't extract the idea of extension out of my notion of an object without losing the notion of the object. So, this idea I have of stuffness or bodies that inherently requires extension as one of the predicates. Okay. So I can not only know it's true without any experience, I can know that it's necessarily true. I can know the nature of the quality of the truth. Okay. I've only to extract from it in accordance with the principles of contradiction. One at the same time, I become aware of its necessity. That's something I could never have been taught by experience. On the other hand, though I do not include in the concept of a body in general the predicate weight, nonetheless, this concept indicates an object of experience through one of its parts, and I can add to that part other parts of the same experience, as in this way belonging together with the concept. From the start, I can apprehend the concept of body and analytically through the characters of extension, impenetrability, figure, etc., all of which are thought in the concept. Now, however, looking back on the experience from which I have derived the concept of body, all right, so he's saying you don't even have a concept of body except for experience. That doesn't matter, right? Your concept of body that you have had at the moment it became a concept you could use, necessarily included extension. And he says impenetrability and shape, I think, or figure, right? So that's interesting. Every body must have a shape. Okay, fine. Now, however, looking back on the experience from which I've derived this concept of body and finding weight to be invariably connected with the above characters, I attach it as a predicate to the concept. And in doing so, I attach it synthetically and am therefore extending my knowledge. Okay. So what he means by weight is mass, essentially, I think. I think maybe I'm doing him an injustice here, but a um a helium balloon has weight even if it wants to float upwards, right? So um what he says is, okay, I know that all objects have extension, shape, all sorts of things. I know from experience that they all have a massive quality to them, but I only know that from experience. If I wanted to sit, I could imagine an object that doesn't push things around, isn't pushed by things, doesn't isn't attracted to other things of the same stuffness nature. He says I can have the notion of a body without the notion of heaviness, even if all bodies have some element of heaviness to them. They all have a mass or an inertial quality or something. Even if that was the case, I'm not getting that a priori. It's not necessary that they do. It just happens to be the fact that I've always seen them have that quality. And so I attach that quality synthetically to the objects, not analytically. I think I'm getting that right. We'll see if I made a mistake and we'll correct it. The possibility of the synthesis of the predicate, oh, synthesis, right? The synthesis of the predicate weight with the concept of body thus rests upon experience, while the one concept is not contained in the other. They yet belong to one another though only contingently as parts of a whole, namely of an experience which is itself a synthetic combination of intuitions. Hmm, that's interesting to me. I wonder if I am reading this wrong. I wonder I wonder that. That's an interesting idea. Could Kant possibly be saying the notion of heaviness isn't a notion? No, because he knows that the notion of body comes through experience too, he says. No, he must be saying what I thought he was saying originally. Okay, which I think is the traditional way of interpreting it. All right, I'll keep it in my mind, but yeah. All right. So, but in a priori synthetic judgments, this help is entirely lacking. Okay, so here's this new category: a priori synthetic judgments. I do not here have the advantage of looking around in the field of experience. Upon what, then, am I to rely? When I seek to go beyond the concept A and to know that another concept B is connected with it, a concept that is not identical to it, that's not necessary to the concept of A. How can I know that B always is connected to A prior to experience? That's right. So far, his example is that's synthetic. It's empirical. It's a posteriori. But he thinks that this a priori synthetic does exist. Through what is the synthesis made possible? Let us take the proposition everything which happens has a cause. wait a second. Causal necessity is not inherent in the concept I have of happenings. I could imagine living in a world full of chaotic events that have no relationship to one another. I could imagine that some event could happen for no cause. I think I can anyway. Cause doesn't seem to be necessary to the concept of happening. In the concept of something which happens, I do indeed think an existence which is preceded by a time, etc. And from this concept, analytic judgments may be obtained. But the concept of a cause lies entirely outside the other concept and signifies something different from that which happens, right? Just the notion something happened doesn't give me it must have been caused, right? So it's not analytic, but it might be a priori. If it's not analytic, it must be synthetic. I'm synthesizing two different notions. I'm saying the causal one is always connected to all the happenings. How do I know that? I don't know it through experience, right? He's coming here to solve the problem that Hume was swirling around with, right? He comes right after Hume to say, look, you're lost. You admit you're lost. You can't know anything. Let's solve this problem. And what he's saying is, okay, I can know something more than just by analyzing what the concept means. And I can do that prior to experience. Let's see how. The concept of a cause lies entirely outside this other concept. It's not just that which happens necessitates causality, and is not therefore in any way contained in this latter representation. How come I then to predicate of that which happens something quite different, and to apprehend that the concept of cause, though not contained in it, yet belongs, and indeed necessarily belongs to it. I not only can know that all events have a causal explanation, but I can know that necessarily they must, even though I'm not knowing it just by analyzing my concept of happening. What is here? The unknown equals X, which gives support to the understanding when it believes that it can discover outside the concept of a predicate B foreign to this concept, which it yet at the same time considers to be connected with it and necessarily connected with it, right? It cannot be experience because the suggested principle has connected the second representation with the first, not only with greater universality, but also with the character of necessity. He said earlier, if something necessarily connects to another idea, it's not synthetic. Oh, no, I'm so sorry. It's not based in experience. It's all things based in experience can't be necessarily true. I think that's what he said earlier. I'm pretty sure. Uh, so hold on. So if I know it and it's foreign to the idea, but I know they must be synthesized, they must be connected, that you can't have one without the other, but it's not just based on the analytic analysis of the meaning of the first term, then oh, that's what he said. I'm so sorry. I used the wrong distinction again. It's a priori. The nature of a posteriori, the nature of all knowledge that comes from experience is that it won't give you something necessarily true. This is what Hume kept pointing out. It's like, look, he wanted to say we only know things a posteriori. Everything is traced back to experience. Oh my God, we don't know anything, he said. I don't know that the sun's coming up tomorrow. I don't know that the future resembles the past. I don't know any. I've never experienced something that would tell me that has to be the case. I know nothing. Science falls apart because of my empirical uh, commitment, right? And Hume is coming in and saying, no, 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 no. Wait, wait. I think I found the category. You can know things that aren't just analytic, and you can know them a priori. And the nature of an a priori knowledge is it's a necessary truth. It can't be without it. Let's see how he can justify that. Okay. Upon such synthetic, wait, where did I skip a line? It cannot be experienced because it's also necessity, and therefore completely a priori and on the basis of mere concepts. Okay, the two concepts must link, but I'm not knowing that they link because of just the nature of this concept. Upon such synthesizing, that is, ampliative principles, all our a priori speculative knowledge must ultimately rest. Analytic judgments are very important and indeed necessary, but only for obtaining that clearness in the concepts which is requisite for such a sure and wide synthesis as will lead to a genuinely new addition to all previous knowledge. He's saying, I think I've done something pretty big here by figuring this out. I think I've solved this crisis that we were in. He's going to come in and be that next consummate thinker in the stage of crisis between the rationalists and the empiricists, the wrestlers of Descartes, Mellenbranche, and Hume. Okay, so let's pause. Do you want to say anything? We'll pause here for a quick second. We have two more sections to read on this, and we'll have finished Kant on this topic. If not, that's pretty clear what we've been talking about here. Are there any questions? Thank God it's pretty clear because we're reading Kant. But it's pretty clear, and it's potentially really significant. Okay, section 5. In all theoretical sciences of reason, synthetic a priori judgments are contained as principles. In all theoretical sciences of reason, synthetic a priori judgments are contained as principles. Okay, so the synthetic a priori judgments that he's identified exist, those are what we call the principles of whatever field of thinking. Okay. All mathematical judgments, right? We're going to talk about mathematical necessity. This is Socrates used this example. This is a big example people like to go to. Okay. All mathematical judgments without exception are synthetic. They're linking two different ideas that aren't inherently connected to each other just because of the first idea, right? It's not identity. And yet they're they're synthetic. That's all he's saying. They're all synthetic. This fact, though incontestably certain and in its consequences very important, has hitherto escaped the notice of those who are engaged in the analysis of human reason and is, indeed, directly opposed to all their conjectures. For as it was found that all mathematical inferences proceed in accordance with the principle of contradiction, which the nature of all apodectic certainty requires, it was supposed that the fundamental propositions of the science can themselves be known to be true through that principle. All right, we have a course coming up soon. Dr. Tartaglia is not only going to give a course on Quine, which is like going to be a pretty high level course, it's comparable to my Nietzsche course in year 3, but even sooner than that, he is doing he's doing a really amazing project. I've been looking at some of what he's up to on Gödel. It's coming soon. We are going to do a crazy deep dive into understanding Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And to do that, just from the bits I've seen from him, we have to understand formal systems. We have to understand all sorts of mathematical projects to try to underpin the notions of 2 plus 2 make 4. I mean, it's all going to be relevant to this. Um, it's going to be it's going to be pretty rock and roll. It's coming eventually, maybe in a month or two. We'll be ready to launch it. Anyway, this is an erroneous view. Okay, what is an erroneous view? It was supposed that the fundamental propositions of the science can themselves be known to be true through that principle, the principle of contradiction, that logically. Okay, this is an erroneous view. For though a synthetic proposition can indeed be discerned in accordance with the principle of contradiction, this can only be if another synthetic proposition is presupposed, and if it can then be apprehended as following from this other proposition. It can never be so discerned in and by itself. We'll see an example soon. First of all, it has to be noted that mathematical propositions, strictly so called, are always judgments a priori, not empirical. That has to be the case, right? Doesn't that have to be the case? Mathematical judgments, geometry. Your geometrical knowledge doesn't come from experience because you've never experienced a triangle. You've never experienced a square. You've never experienced a point. The notions that we use in math, you can utilize triangles. You can make approximations of them. You can utilize fiveness as a concept, but you didn't get that concept. The fiveness itself, the ability to understand triangles and the implications or necessary qualities of them didn't come from experience because you've never seen a triangle. Okay. Because they carry with them, oh, just to be clear in case anybody's listening, the reason why you've never seen a triangle is that a triangle is made up of points that have no length, breadth, and width. The concept or the definition of triangle is, like three in a three-sided enclosed figure or something like that. But figures are made up of extensionless things. So everything you've ever experienced has extension. All right. Which cannot be derived from experience. If this be demurred to, I am willing to limit my statement to pure mathematics, the very concept of which implies that it does not contain empirical, but only pure a priori knowledge. Okay, so let's look at his examples within mathematics. Remember, he had said, like mathematics, there's this whole metaphysics thing. We should put a hold on that until we figure out the foundations of all this and the quality of this knowledge. Then who knows what we'll be able to figure out metaphysically. But mathematics, everybody agrees. Okay, this is all a priori. So let's look at these categories this way. We might indeed at first suppose that the proposition 7 and 5 make 12 is a merely analytic proposition and follows by the principle of contradiction from the concept of a sum of 7 and 5. But if we look more closely, we find that the concept of the sum of 7 and 5 contains nothing save the union of the two numbers into one. And in this, no thought is being taken as to what that single number may be, which combines both. The concept of 12 is by no means already thought in merely thinking this union of 7 and 5. And I may analyze my concept of such a possible sum as long as I please. Still, I shall never find the 12ness in it, or he says the 12 in it. We have to go outside these concepts and call in the aid of the intuition, which corresponds to one of them, our five fingers, for instance, or as Senger does in his arithmetic, 5 points, adding to the concept of seven, unit by unit, the five given in intuition. For starting with the number seven, and for the concept of five calling in the aid of the fingers on my hand as intuition, I now add one by one to the number seven the units which I previously took together to form the number five, and with the aid of that figure, the hand, see the number 12 coming into being. That five should be added to seven. I have indeed already thought in the concept of the sum equals 7 plus 5, but not that this sum is equivalent to the number 12. Arithmetical propositions are therefore always synthetic. This is still more evident if we take larger numbers, for it is then obvious that however we might turn and twist our concepts, we could never, by the mere analysis of them and without the aid of intuition, discover what the number is. The number is that is the sum. Okay, so let's pause here. He's given us our first example to try to wrap our minds to sink our teeth into here on this whole a priori synthetic knowledge. He says, okay, be honest. He makes it easier at the end when he says, well, what about big numbers? Right. But let's be honest. I'm going to think about sevenness a lot right now. And I'm going to think about the concept of uniting two different quantities of sumness. And I'm going to think about the concept of fiveness. And I'm going to think about the sum of five and seven. I'm going to think about what I'm going to think about the union of five and seven, the conglomeration of fivenesses and sevennesses put together. There's nothing in there that tells me it has to be 12. It could be 13. It could be 11. There's nothing just in thinking about the concepts of summation of sevenness and fiveness that means 12ness. This is what he's saying. This is exactly what the logical positivists are going to argue against. And then when they collapse, we're going to have to figure out what we do. But he says, if you really just he's just doing the same thing that he did with extension and bodies. He said the notion of bodies means extension. But then he said, but the notion of bodies means mass, And I can know that that's necessarily true, even though I can't know it just by the notion of bodies. 7 plus 5 make 12 is like that second category. I know that 7 and 5 necessarily must always be 12. I don't need to go and gather 7 cars and 5 cars and count them and see that there's 12 and then gather, 7 toothpicks and 5 toothpicks. I don't have to go do any experiments. I can know necessarily that 7 and 5 make 12. But it's like the second category there. It's synthetic. It's giving me new knowledge that the concept of the summation of 7 and 5 doesn't actually give me. He says, if you don't believe that, if you think analyze 7-ness and 5-ness and you'll see the 12-ness is there, he says, well, okay, what's the sum of 6,235 times the square root of 934? Examine just those notions without trying to extract and use intuition and mathematical principles to get to the answer. Just think about the square root of 239. I don't remember what number I said, and the sum of that and 605,462. You're not going to see the answer. It's not in the concept of just the sum of the square root of this number and this other number. Okay, so where is it? Well, it necessarily is what it is. And if you do a bunch of intuition, mathematical, instinctive work, and you use your pen and paper, or you're a savant and you go through some processes, you can get to the answer. And it necessarily will be the answer every time. So it's not a posteriori, it's still a priori. It's still a priori. It's still something you know prior to experience and without the aid of experience. And it has the quality of being necessarily true. And yet it's adding something new that it's synthesizing the 12-ness concept. I've got the concept of 13-ness and 15-ness and all sorts of other numbers, but the 12-ness concept synthesizes. It's necessarily glued to the concept of the summation of 7-ness and 5-ness. I can know it's always true. It's a priori synthetic knowledge. I've synthesized two concepts that are not inherent within each other. I've synthesized them and they're necessarily true, so they're still a priori. Okay, that's a good example. Thank you, Kant, of what he means. So let's move on. Just as little is any fundamental proposition of pure geometry analytic. Okay, so he's going to say, he's going to give us a second example. Pure geometry, it's also not analytic. That the straight line between 2 points is the shortest is a synthetic proposition. For my concept of straight contains nothing of quantity, but only of quality. The concept of the shortest is wholly an addition and cannot be derived through any process of analysis from the concept of the straight line. Intuition, therefore, must here be called in. Only by its aid is the synthesis possible. Okay. This is cool. He's mentioned intuition a few times. Let's highlight that, circle it. Let's just look at what he means by intuition. Intuition serves the role of a non experiential additional cognitive faculty that we utilize to do synthesis between two notions that are not inherent within one another, but yet are necessarily connected. Okay. If all we do is logically figure out that the one idea contains this other idea, we don't need intuition. We just need to analyze that first idea. But if we're going to synthesize two ideas where that doesn't work, then we have this other faculty called intuition, mathematical intuition, the ideas of counting. In this case, you say, all right, imagine the next point in a long series of points, neither diverging from the connection between the other point and itself, the previous point, right? Take your concept of straightness, take your notion of straightness and analyze it as much as you want. Is there anything about straightness as a path between 2 points that tells you for sure it's the shortest path between 2 points? There's nothing in the straightness because the quality, I'm sorry, the features of the concept of straightness don't contain quantity within them. They just contain uh, an unvarying, progressive, uh, changelessness in direction, something like that. That's the notion. So you can't say that it's in the category of all bodies are extended because you don't get it analytically. You're actually taking a very different concept of quantity, comparisons of the lengths of different lines, and you're gluing it to a concept of straightness. And you're necessarily gluing it to it because you've come to the knowledge that for sure that's the mode by which you make the shortest path between 2 points. It's necessarily always going to be that way, he says. So you've got a necessary a priori truth, something that you don't have to do a single experiment in the universe to know is true. And if you did a billion experiments, you still wouldn't know it was true. And you wouldn't know it was necessarily true, even if you did all the possible experiments and measured all of the shortest paths between all of the possible points. Except one, you wouldn't even know it was true. But if you did it with all of them, you still wouldn't even know it was necessarily true. But you can know not only is it universally true and necessarily true, you can do it before or away from or prior to any experience, and that thing you've just accomplished is still synthetic. You're able to do that with two notions that just the idea, just the analysis of the idea isn't enough to let you do that. Why? Because you have this faculty of intuition. All right, we're getting him now. The concept of the shortest is wholly an addition and cannot be derived through any process of analysis, analytic, from the concept of the straight line. Intuition, therefore, must here be called in. Only by its aid is the synthesis possible. What here causes us commonly to believe that the predicate of such apodectic judgments is already contained in our concept, and that the judgment is therefore analytic, is merely the ambiguous character of the terms used. So he says sometimes people make the mistake of thinking that it is analytic because the notion of straightness means the shortest distance. He goes, no, 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 no. There's an ambiguity and we make a mistake there. It's not true. You actually have to add a new notion that isn't inherent within it. And here's how we make the mistake. We are required to join in thought a certain predicate to a given concept, and this necessity is inherent in the concepts themselves, not the first concept. But the question is not what we ought to join in thought to the given concept, but what we actually think in it, even if only obscurely. And it is then manifest that while the predicate is indeed attached necessarily to the concept, it is so in virtue of an intuition which must be added to the concept, not as thought in the concept itself. Some few fundamental propositions presupposed by the geometrician are, I love that, the geometrician, are indeed really analytic and rest on the principle of contradiction. But as identical propositions, they serve only as links in the chain of method and not as principles. Oh, interesting. Interesting. I'm going to keep this question in mind. The question is, does Kant agree with the logical positivists that some a priori notions are analytical and therefore maybe merely tautological? Those would be the ones like all bodies have extension, whereas some are synthetic. And of course, they just deny that second category. It sounds like that might be the relationship of their battle. Let's see. But as identical propositions, they serve only as links in the chain of the method and not as principles. Principles. What are principles? This title of this section is Principles are in the theoretical sciences of reason, synthetic a priori judgments. That's where we get our principles. Okay. For instance, A equals A. That's the identity principle, or we would call it the identity principle. A is equivalent to itself. The whole is equal to itself, or A plus B is greater than A. That is, the whole is greater than its part. And even these propositions, though they are valid according to pure concepts, are only admitted in mathematics because they can be exhibited in intuition. Okay, hold on a second. He's saying even those are principles. Those are principles. They're not true merely because of logical analysis of the concepts. Let me make sure that's right. As identical propositions, they serve only as links in the chain of method and not as principles. For instance, A equals A, the whole is equal to itself, or A plus something else is greater than A alone, the whole is greater than its part. Even these propositions, though they are valid according to pure concepts, are only admitted in mathematics because they can be exhibited in intuition. Doesn't he? I'm misunderstanding this. I feel like he's contradicting himself. Are those supposed to be examples of things that are not principles? All right, forgive me. We're going to reread this paragraph, these two sentences. Some few fundamental propositions, some few, presupposed by the geometrician are indeed really analytic and rest on the principle of contradiction. That's one category. But as identical propositions, they serve only as links in the chain of the method and not as principles. Yeah, so shouldn't these next two things be examples of that? For instance, the identity principle and the greater than the part principle. And then he says, but even these propositions, though they are valid according to pure concepts, are only admitted in mathematics because they can be exhibited in intuition. Somebody in the chat tell me why he's using the word intuition there if he's only been using the word intuition for the other category of non-analytic but synthetic things. Somebody help me out. I'm obviously making a mistake. Okay, let's move on. It doesn't look like it's a devastating mistake for now. We'll get it fixed in time. Two, natural science, that's physics, contains a priori synthetic judgments as principles. Natural science, like physics, contains a priori synthetic judgments as principles. I need cite only two such judgments. Sorry, we lost you here. Let me add you back in. I need cite only two such judgments, that in all changes of the material world, the quality of matter remains unchanged, and that in all communication of motion action. All right, cool. All right, I'll be right back. We'll get the tech issue fixed. One moment. Okay, we fixed the tech issues. All right, I realized in that brief moment what it was that I was misunderstanding. Intuition, he had mentioned it when he was talking about the synthetic, but that's not a distinction. Obviously, the principles of figuring out what's inherently necessary in the first concept also rely upon intuition. And so he's saying, like, for instance, the identity principle and things like that. So he's saying those aren't principles, actually. We're misusing the term principle because they're not synthetic. Rather, they're necessarily true, but they're also understandable just through the analysis of the meanings of the terms, right? So they're not synthetic. They require intuition too, by the way. Oh, we did it again. Oh, there we are. They require intuition also, is all he's saying there. And so intuition isn't a distinctive factor between these two categories, is whether or not you need intuition. That clarifies what he was saying before. Can you hear me now? Are we getting this fixed? I think we're in.
Yeah, yeah, I can. I'm good, thanks.
I think you just said something, but I can't hear you. So we'll get that fixed in a moment. Write in the chat if you need me to stop. Okay. So now he's going to move on from that, like mathematics, say, to an empirical science. So he says physics contains a priori synthetic judgments. Those are involved as principles in physics. They are principles. I need cite only two such judgments, that in all changes of the material world, the quantity of matter remains unchanged, and that in all communication of motion, action and reaction must always be equal. Both propositions, it is evident, are not only necessary and therefore in their origin a priori, but also synthetic. For in the concept of matter, I do not think its permanence, but only its presence in the space which it occupies. The concept of matter alone. So he's given us some good examples, and it would be worth just pausing to say, okay, we see the way he's thinking about these two categories and applying them. Let's practice it with him. Okay, this is Kant if he was as dumb as I am, dealing with this exact same thought process. Just gonna make it all right. Duh. The presence of an object is all I need to know in order to know that I'm dealing with some amount of matter. The matter can go through changes, but the quantity of matter can't change. However, okay, I know that that's necessarily always true. So that's the first lens. It's necessarily always true that whatever changes happen to matter, the before and the after have the same amount of matter. It has to be that way, so it's a priori. However, is it analytic or is it synthetic? If it's synthetic a priori, it's one of the first principles. It's one of the principles that allows physics to work and to be doable. If it's analytic, it's not really a principle so much as, I mean, he doesn't want to call it a principle, but he's going to say it's like what is language? Even these propositions, they're pure concepts, exhibited intuition as well. Anyway, they're okay. So the first thing is we know we've hit on an a priori truth because it has to be true. If it's necessarily true, he says nothing synthetic is necessarily true. Nothing, that's what he said earlier. Nothing synthetic is necessarily true. So if we know it's necessarily true, we know that it is. I'm so sorry. I misspoke. My bad. Kant said earlier that nothing based in experience is necessarily true. Nothing a posteriori is necessarily true. You see how hard it is to keep these two distinctions separate, right? A priori, a posteriori. That's the first one. And then when it passes that, we're going to try to put it through the other one, synthetic analytic, see what happens. So the first thing he does is he says, here's a truth. No matter what changes happen to matter, you have to have the same amount of matter at the end that you had at the beginning. Could be in different forms, right? Hydrogen, oxygen, H2O, different forms, different amounts, different whatever, but the same quantity of matter has to be in both. Okay. I know that has to be the case. I can't even think it must be the case in every change of matter. Therefore, since it's necessary, it is not based in experience. It is a priori. Good. I have an a priori truth. Let me take it over here, put it through my Kantian analysis for the next question. The next question is this a principle of physics because it's synthetic, or is it like saying all bodies have extension because the notion itself of matter means that it must be something that can neither be created nor destroyed. All right. So it says, okay, is it an analytic a priori truth or a synthetic a priori truth? Let me see. In order to conceive of matter, I just have to imagine it being somewhere. I don't have to imagine that it can't ever not be, that it can't just pop into I can easily imagine that. The concept of matter doesn't require that I think that it always sticks around and can't be destroyed or created. So it's a priori because it has to be the case, but I must have synthesized some other idea to it because the idea of matter itself doesn't inherently require that. I could imagine matter that does pop into existence and go out of existence. So it's necessarily true. It's an a priori truth, and yet it's synthetic. So it's one of the it's one of the principles of physics. Okay. So we've seen him do this a few times. It's worth it's a good formula to have if we want to put on our Kantian hats and try to think like Kant. Okay. Both propositions it is evident are not only necessary and therefore in their priority. Okay. So the first one was matter The quantity of matter remains unchanged no matter what change happens to matter. And the second, and that in all communication of motion, action and reaction must always be equal. Both propositions are evident in and are and not only necessary, and both propositions, it is evident, are not only necessary, and therefore in their origin a priori, but also synthetic. For in the concept of matter, I do not think of its permanence, but only of its presence in space which it occupies. I go outside and beyond the concept of matter, joining it a priori in thought, joining to it a priori in thought, something which I have not thought in it. That's his whole formula here. This is pretty cool. The proposition is not, therefore, analytic, but synthetic, and yet is thought a priori. And so, likewise, are the other propositions of the pure part of natural science. Number three, let's go to a new subject. Wait a minute. We did mathematics, pure math. We did physical natural science, metaphysics. Even if we look upon it as having hitherto failed in all its endeavors, is yet, owing to the nature of human reason, a quite indispensable science and ought to contain a priori synthetic knowledge. For its business is not merely to analyze concepts which we make for ourselves a priori of things and thereby to clarify them analytically, but to extend our a priori knowledge. And for this purpose, we must employ principles which add to the given concept something that was not contained in it and through a priori synthetic judgments venture out so far that experience is quite unable to follow us, as for example in the proposition that the world must have a first beginning and such like. Thus metaphysics consists, at least in intention, entirely of a priori synthetic propositions. So now Kant has three fields of subjects. Pure mathematics. It's like, notice that in all three of these, this a priori synthetic plays an important role. Um, all of mathematics is a priori. It can apply to the real world. You can make use of it, of course, but understanding that the sum of the angles of a square are the same as the internal angles of a circle, or that half of that amount of angles of turningness is contained within a triangle or something like that. That is that's not based in experience. It's all a priori, but it has an a priori synthetic component. He made that argument. Then in the natural sciences, the things that seem to be about experience, there's this a priori synthetic element. It gives us principles that allow us to do the science in the first place. And then it seems like, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like what he's saying about metaphysics is all of metaphysics is based in the a priori synthetic. We're not even interested in the physics, we're interested in the beyond physics. We're not interested in the physics, we're interested in the metaphysics, right? So even if you think there's never been a true thing ever said in metaphysics, look what I'm doing. I'm giving us the groundwork to start a new science of the metaphysics. That's part of the impact of what I'm doing here. Okay, so that wraps that up. The role of the a priori synthetic in all three of those domains, all empirical sciences, pure mathematics, and metaphysics, as the source of the principles that make the thinking possible. Okay, let's do the last section as quickly as we can. Kant's pretty heavy, right? I mean, just it's dense. It's like chewing on a big steak. All right. The general problem of pure reason. Hmm. Back to pure reason. What's its general problem? Much is already gained if we can bring a number of investigations under the formula of a single problem. For we not only lighten our own task, but defining it accurately, by defining it accurately, but make it easier for others who would test our results to judge whether or not we have succeeded in what we set out to do. Now, the proper problem of pure reason is contained in the question, how are a priori synthetic judgments possible? If you've been listening all this way and you say, I know it's I know it's a priori, it's universal, it's actually necessary, it's beyond universal, it's necessarily true. Therefore, it must be a priori. Look, I've analyzed how I came to know it, and it's not through just analyzing the idea, but there's a synthesis of two different ideas that not inherent. It's definitely a priori synthetic, but that's him analyzing the thinking. He hasn't even he's saying, okay, how is it possible? He's mentioned intuition is used in order to do this. If you've been thinking, well, wait a minute, how is it possible that we could know things that aren't inherent in the notions without any experience? That's the question, Kant says. How is it even possible? That metaphysics has hitherto remained in so vacillating a state of uncertainty and contradiction is entirely due to the fact that this problem, and perhaps even the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments, has never properly been considered. Okay. Upon the solution of this problem, or upon a sufficient proof that the possibility which it desires to have explained does in fact not exist at all, depends the success or failure of metaphysics. Among philosophers, David Hume came nearest to envisaging this problem, but still was very far from conceiving it with sufficient definiteness and universality. He, he occupied himself exclusively with the synthetic proposition regarding the connection of an effect with its cause, principium causalitatis. And he believed himself, the principle of causality, right? And he believed himself to have shown that such an a priori proposition is entirely impossible. Right? He thinks, I know for sure we don't have that based. Okay. If we accept this his conclusions, then all that we call metaphysics is a mere delusion, whereby we fancy ourselves to have rational insight into what, in actual fact, is borrowed solely from experience, and under the influence of custom, has taken the illusory resemblance of necessity. If he had envisaged our problem in all its universality, he would never have been guilty of this statement, so destructive of all pure philosophy. For he would then have recognized that, according to his own argument, pure mathematics, as certainly containing a priori synthetic propositions, would also not be possible. And from such an assertion, his good sense would have saved him. Yeah, maybe. The one thing about Hume that we've seen is his commitment to his commitment to let's just say for now, his commitment took him beyond insanity. I mean, it took him to places that even he said what I'm saying makes no sense. But okay. And there's a few other things he's speculating about Hume, which don't seem correct, but that's okay. All of his talk about the ideas seems we can understand that that's the Kantian perspective, and there's nothing to quarrel with there right now. Okay. In the solution of the above problem, we are at the same time deciding as to the possibility of the employment of pure reason in establishing and developing all those sciences which contain a theoretical a priori knowledge of objects and have therefore to answer the questions, how is pure mathematics possible? How is pure science of nature possible? Okay, so he's giving us a distinction between math and pure math, between physics and pure physics. Okay, we'll remember that he has a lot of category names, so we'll remember that he's done that. Okay, let me read this again. In the solution of the above problem, we are at the same time deciding the possibility of the employment of pure reason in establishing and developing all of those sciences which establish a theoretical a priori knowledge of objects. Okay, so you can do mathematics, you can do pure mathematics. What's that? It's using pure reason in order to, get the basic principles and that type of thing. Same with physics. You can do physics and do some experiments and measure out and try to figure out what the formula, what the consequences, blah blah blah. But you can also do some philosophy. You can do some pure physics, with pure science, which is analyzing the concepts and figuring out truths about that field that will have to apply based on not just analyzing the concepts, but finding necessary truths between the concepts. Okay, so using pure reason. Since these sciences actually exist, it is quite proper to ask how they are possible. For that, they must be possible is proved by the fact that they exist. But the poor progress which has hitherto been made in metaphysics, and the fact that no system yet propounded can, in view of the essential purpose of metaphysics, be said really to exist, leaves everyone sufficient ground for doubting as to its possibility. We're all doing this in mathematics. We're all doing this in the pure sciences. to find the principles, the science of finding the principles of natural science. But we could ask ourselves, is what we're doing even possible? Is it just like Hume would have suggested? It's convention. It's really all based in experience. And so we just sort of, eh, if you presume that the future resembles the past, it's worked out well so far. Or has, as Kant has said, no, 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 I've got a notion of necessarily. It's not even thinkable that it couldn't be. And yet it's not contained within the idea. He says, I see that that's the nature of those ideas. But then the question is, okay, it works in practice. Does it work in theory? That's sort of his question here. It works in practice. His philosophy about the quality of these ideas works in practice for the ideas, but is it even possible? Okay. Yet, in a certain sense, this kind of knowledge, this quality of a priori synthetic, is to be looked upon as given. That is to say, metaphysics actually exists, if not as a science, yet still as natural disposition, metaphysica naturalis. For human reason, without being moved merely by the idle desire for extent and variety of knowledge, proceeds impetuously, driven on by an inward need to questions such as cannot be answered by any empirical employment of reason, or by principles thence derived. Thus, in all men, as soon as their reason has become ripe for speculation, there has always existed and will always continue to exist some kind of metaphysics. And so we have the question, how is metaphysics as natural disposition possible? Very important that we're asking this question carefully. You say, I got a new question. It might be a psychological question. It might be a question about the nature of what constitutes our tools of thinking, right? It's almost like I've looked at the nature of the knowledge and the truth like Hume did, but I'm bringing in this other ingredient of how is it possible that creatures like us exist who have access to this type of knowledge? How is it possible that we have a natural disposition to be able to acquire an understanding of the necessity of certain propositions that are not merely analytical? And then to go forward trying to figure that stuff out before we've even asked these questions. Okay. That is, how from the nature of universal human reason do those questions arise which pure reason propounds to itself and which it is impelled by its own need to answer as best it can? But since all attempts which have hitherto been made to answer these natural questions, for instance, whether the world has a beginning or is from eternity, have always met with unavoidable contradictions, we cannot rest satisfied with the mere natural disposition to metaphysics. That is, with the pure faculty of reason itself, from which, indeed, some sort of metaphysics, be it what it may, always arises. It must be possible for reason to attain to certainty, whether we know or do not know the objects of metaphysics. That is, to come to a decision either in regard to the objects of its inquiries or in regard to the capacity or incapacity of reason to pass any judgment upon them, so that we may either with confidence extend our pure reason or set to it sure and determined limits. He hasn't done this yet. He doesn't even know if he's gonna do it, but we need to do this because that's where we would know. That's where we would be. We would know that we can extend through pure reason some real knowledge, or we'll know for sure exactly why we can't know certain things if we get this new project I'm suggesting done. Okay. This last question, which arises out of the previous general problem, may, rightly stated, take the form, how is metaphysics as science possible? He's clearly using science as a way of knowing, not as an empirical thing, clearly. So he's been using science in all these questions, but that's what he means by it. Okay, right. Um, pure science of the natural. So, pure science of science is basically what that second question means. His fourth question is, how is metaphysics as a way of knowing possible? Okay, this is the end of the essay. Here we go. Thus, the critique of reason in the end necessarily leads to scientific knowledge. While its dogmatic employment, on the other hand, lands us in dogmatic assertions to which other assertions, equally specious, can always be opposed. That is in skepticism. This science cannot be of any very formidable prolixity, since it has to deal not with the objects of reason, the variety of which is inexhaustible, but only with itself and the problems which arise entirely from within itself, and which are imposed upon it by its own nature, not by the nature of things which are distinct from it. When once reason has learnt completely to understand its own power in respect to objects which can be presented to it in experience, it should easily be able to determine with completeness and certainty the extent and the limits of its attempted employment beyond the bounds of all experience. All right, he keeps highlighting how important this critique of pure reason is. He wants to do this critique of pure reason. He's saying, let's look at the way we're thinking, let's make some categories for the moves we're making. Let's do all of this definitions and let's figure out how it is we can come to know a priori synthetic truths. If we figured that out, we would be certain not only of our scientific knowledge, what we can know and what we can't know, but we would be certain of our metaphysical knowledge, what we can know, what we can't know. And we wouldn't just be sort of speculating and then you can oppose the speculation with the opposite speculation. He thinks metaphysics is a very important subject, but nothing we've done so far is as solid a metaphysics as I think we could have if we would do this first. Okay. We may then, and indeed we must, regard as abortive all attempts hitherto made to establish a metaphysic dogmatically. For the analytic part in any such attempted system, namely the mere analysis of the concepts that inhere in our reason a priori, is by no means the aim of, but only a preparation for metaphysics proper. That is, the extension of its a priori synthetic knowledge. For such a purpose, the analysis of concepts is useless, since it merely shows what is contained in these concepts. Right? We get it. Not how we arrive at them a priori. A solution. All right, so let's just be clear about what he's saying here. He's saying, Savad, Zara, you're starting on Fridays this whole philosophy of religion thing, right? The nature of God, his attributes, existence, all of that stuff. You're gonna go do some metaphysics, huh? You excited about that? You think that's a pretty groovy thing to do? I know already, says Kant. You will all argue about the necessary implications of the concepts that you're using, and you won't progress your knowledge synthetically, because any attempt to do that, I think this is what he's saying. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. Any attempt to do that without the aid of a critique of pure reason first, if that's all you're doing, necessarily reduces to the analytic. And that's not synthetic. That's the distinction, right? It's all just, oh, you figured out what the notion had to mean, but you're not advancing the knowledge synthetically beyond that. Unless we get a critique of pure reason and a science of the sciences, right? How is pure mathematics possible? How is the pure science of natural science possible? How is metaphysics as a way of knowing possible? How is metaphysics as a natural disposition possible? That's an interesting question, because if the one I read third, which is his fourth question, isn't possible, then you'd really have to wonder why we're all built in a way where we think we can do that. Okay, so here we go. For such a purpose, the analysis of concepts is useless and merely show the contained in these concepts, not how we arrive at them a priori. A solution to this latter problem is required, that we may be able to determine the valid employment of such concepts in regard to the objects of all knowledge in general, all the categories he gave. Nor is much self denial needed to give up these claims, seeing that the undeniable, and in the dogmatic procedure of reason also unavoidable, contradictions of reason with itself have long since undermined the authority of every metaphysical system yet propounded. Greater firmness will be required if we are not to be deterred by inward difficulties and outward opposition from endeavoring, through application of a method entirely different from any hitherto employed, at last to bring to a prosperous and fruitful growth a science indispensable to human reason, a science whose every branch may be cut away, but whose root cannot be destroyed. All right. So, one of the things that we can see from this last section overall that he's done in this, we're done overall, is that he's advocating for a new philosophical discipline, and he's going to try to do it. We're not going to read any more Kant now um, in this section. He's one of our major thinkers that we have to wrestle with in year two, and we'll read other essays by him in other sections, of course. We're mostly reading this in order to, one, try to understand Kant like we do with every author that we read, but within the context of trying to understand the definition of a priori and synthetic and the nature of or a priori and a posteriori and an analytic and synthetic and the relationship of those categories. So now we have Kant's idea. And if we want to just put it up here one more time, the Kantian idea is there are a priori analytic ideas. They're not really principles. They're they're necessarily true, so they're analytic, but there's also a priori synthetic ideas. Those are things that are gluing two different concepts together that are not inherent within the first concept. The first concept doesn't require the second one, and yet it's still necessary that they be glued together in an a priori kind of way. Anything a posteriori cannot be necessary. So notice that he's not proving it's a priori, except that it's a necessary truth. So he doesn't know how we come to know a priori synthetic truths, but he knows he knows them when he sees them. That's what Kant is doing so far. He's saying, I know him when I see him. I know that if it's necessarily true, it is not derived from experience. As Hume pointed out, I can have a billion experiences of the sun coming up. I have no idea if it's going to come up the next day. I don't. I really don't. I can use custom and just go along with it, but that's no kind of knowledge, says Hume, and Kant would agree. But the valuable principles of knowledge within pure mathematics, within science itself, which is the pure science of the science, and within metaphysics would have to be of the nature of a priori synthetic that he's identified. So in this section, we're going to be reading other perspectives pretty soon, which are going to argue against that, and they're going to have their own problems. But there's a lot of things that are powerful about Kant's perspective. There are a lot of things that people can try to launch attacks against. And I would really like to get into all of that, but I think we're going to do it in the after conversation. So we're going to end the recording, and Savad and I are going to go talk more about all these things for about an hour or so. And then we are going to see you next week, where we'll read, I think Mill is next. Let's see. The next essay we want to read here is, yeah, we're going to read John Stuart Mill. We've got 4 more essays in this 5th of the 8 sections in our Backbone Year 1 course, where we're taking 8 different subjects in philosophy and cherry picking, reading the essays, and getting just a general feel for the battlefield of free will and determinism, the existence of God, the nature of moral judgments, right? Now we're doing the a priori section. It's the 5th of the 8 sections we do in the Backbone course of the first year material. Tomorrow we're doing our literature. We're going to continue reading The 1001 Nights and Salman Rushdie's 2 years, 8 months, and 28 nights. In that literature thing, we're going to start earlier than we do today, and we're going to do a Twitter Spaces right afterwards for everybody to grab a mic and talk. We're doing on Thursday our year 1 course, which is a bit of a deeper dive, just like this first Backbone course, but we're doing the philosophy of mind. We've just started the behaviorism section. And on Friday at the same time, which we start an hour earlier than we started today, on both those days, we're continuing our philosophy of religion course. It's a year 1 course. On Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern time, for an hour and a half, we are continuing our year 3 course of this deep dive of the students of Nietzsche, where we're looking very carefully at Jordan Peterson. We think it'll be our 11th class, and we're only into the second of his biblical significance videos, psychological significance of the biblical stories. And on Mondays, we're doing Plato's dialogues We also start earlier, and we're doing spaces after that. So we've had 4 dialogues we've read so far. So on Monday, we'll be reading our 5th one, and we'll be talking more about that. Okay, so bye to everybody who's watching in outside. We're going to go discuss this Kant guy some more, and we'll see you all whenever you want to come to any of those things and the other ones I forgot about. Peace.